In this video, we're going to talk about variables. And in fact, we're going to talk about variables throughout the whole course. But specifically, we're going to talk about 7 different kinds of variables. And then we're also going to differentiate between observable variables and something we're going to call constructs. So let's take a look at the word variables first. At its root is the word vary. Vary means to change or be different or to have different levels. And this is what a variable represents, differences. So we might have variables that are specific characteristics of individuals, such as age, gender, personality, health condition, and attitudes. These are things that can vary from person to person. They are variables. Variables also can be factors that influence individuals. Let's take a look at an example of this. Let's say you're taking a test. Either the room is too hot or too cold, and this affects your performance. It has nothing to do with your intelligence or how prepared you were for the exam, but it's an external variable that causes a change. Variables can be different from person to person. They can represent different values. So the degree of something might vary, the severity might vary, the intensity might vary. We might have different degrees to which we agree with our own political parties, for example. So these are ways that we can vary in degree, severity, or intensity. So here's an example. Some of us are more introverted, while some of us are more extroverted. There's a variable between people. But also the degree to which we express our personality might change within the situation. So the situation becomes a variable. Some variables can be observed and measured. And so things such as height, weight, age, or off-task behavior, if I were to count how many times a student was off-task. These are easy. Psychology is not always easy, though, because we're interested in things that cannot be directly measured most of the time. So we develop constructs, and these are variables that represent those internal attributes or characteristics. So constructs are not directly observed, but they're useful for describing and explaining behavior. So here's an example of a construct, self-esteem. Can't directly measure it. We have an idea of what it is. Happiness. Can't really put a finger on happiness. We know what it is. It's a construct. Depression is a construct. Love is a construct. These are all things that we can't pin down with an observable measurement necessarily as they are. So what we do is we operationally define a construct. This means using external behaviors that can be observed and measured and used as a proxy for that thing. So we have to identify a measurement procedure, a count, a number, maybe some scores. So let's take a stab at this. What are some ways that we could measure a person's happiness, the construct of happiness? So pause the video and write down some ways that you could measure happiness. All right, here are some ideas. You can count the number of smiles somebody has per hour. You can use a rating scale of their happiness. You can measure their heart rate and their pupil dilation. Or you can count the number of times they laugh during the day. These are all operational definitions of the construct of happiness. Let's take a look at some different variables. First, we're going to start with the independent variable. When we are doing an experiment, this is a very important variable. It's the variable that is manipulated by the researcher to determine its effect on some other dependent variable. We're going to look at some examples of this. Basically, keep this in mind. The independent variable in a research study is often the grouping variable. As the researcher, I put people into groups and I study the difference between the groups. The dependent variable is that thing that I'm interested in changing. So it's the variable that I measure as the researcher because it's expected to change. Now, I think some examples will help with this, so let's take a look. Let's identify some independent and dependent variables. Results from an experiment indicate that increasing the amount of indoor lighting during the winter months results in significantly lower levels of depression. This is an experiment. So what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? The independent variable is the thing that I manipulate as a researcher, and the dependent variable is the thing I measure that I expect to change as a result of my manipulation. So the indoor lighting is the independent variable, or the indoor lighting versus the control group is the independent variable. It's the thing that I vary. I put some people in the indoor lighting group. I put some people in a group that doesn't have indoor lighting. That's the independent variable. And the thing that changes as a result of either having indoor lighting or not having indoor lighting is depression, levels of depression. So that's the dependent variable. Let's try another one. Results from an experiment suggest that students who cram for hours in one study session perform worse than students who use spaced out study sessions. So what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? The type of study session the students were assigned to is the independent variable, and their performance is the dependent variable. Their performance depends on the type of study session they were in. Here's another one. A professor examines memory recall in a Psychology 101 course for a group of students who read from an ebook and a group of students who read from a hard copy of the same text. Scores on a test are compared. Well, as the researcher, I put people into either the ebook group or the hard copy group. That's the independent variable. That's what I manipulated. And their memory recall is the dependent variable. It's the thing that I measured on the test. If you thought test, that's also correct. It's the dependent variable. It's the thing that depended on what group they were in. Let's talk about extraneous variables. An extraneous variable is a variable in the environment that unintentionally changes the outcome of a study. We gave an example of this earlier. If you're taking a test in a very cold classroom, for example, that will affect the results of your performance that has nothing to do with what you actually know about whatever it is that you're being tested on. It's an extraneous variable that affects all people in the study in the same way. A confounding variable is a type of extraneous variable, and this is a variable that runs in sync with the independent variable, so you really can't determine which one is changing the dependent variable. So let's look at an example of this. A researcher is interested in knowing whether a certain exercise program leads to weight loss. She weighs 100 participants and then randomly assigns them to two conditions: exercise and no exercise. I already know that's the independent variable. It's what I'm doing as a researcher to manipulate, put into groups. At the end of 6 months, she weighs them again and finds that the exercise group has lost 3 pounds. So the weighing is the dependent variable. It's the thing that's going to change depending on what group they're in. She's very excited to publish her results. But the question is, what are some confounding variables? Things that also might be responsible for the 3-pound difference. Pause the computer and write down some things that you think might be responsible. So let's take a look at some possible confounding variables. Diet is one. It's possible that the people in the no exercise group also were on lower calorie diets. Age is another possibly confounding variable. Were all the people in the exercise group younger? It's easier for people who are younger to lose weight. Gender. It's easier for males to lose weight than females, and so maybe there were more males in the weight loss group. Medication might have had something to do with it, health conditions. There are all sorts of things that might have really been responsible for this difference that are in addition to or in place of the independent variable. Let's take a look at the last 3 types of variables. We have something called categorical variables. These are variables that don't have a numerical response. They're usually a fixed set of possible values. And assigning someone to a category is done based on some qualitative property, some characteristic. So an example of categorical variables might be personality types. People have different personality types. They can be categorized. They can be put into groups. Shirt size, you might be put in the large shirt size, the medium shirt size, the small shirt size group. Cancer diagnoses, people can be put into groups depending on their type of cancer diagnosis. So whenever we can put people into categories, we call that a categorical variable. These variables don't have any numerical value in them, however. The next type of variable is called a discrete variable. This variable does have a numerical response, but it's through a counting process. So when we can count the number of something, it's a discrete variable. These are separate values, these numbers. They can't be divided. There's no in-between values. So an example of this might be the number of family members that you have. You actually don't have 2.5 family members. Maybe you have 3, maybe you have 6. these are numbers that you can count, but they can't be divided up. They're whole countable numbers. The number of credits that you're taking in school, that's a whole countable number. And maybe the number of likes that you have on social media, again, that can't be divided into 1.5 likes. These are things that are whole numbers. These are discrete variables that can be produced through counting. And the last type of variable we're going to talk about is a continuous variable. This is a very important variable. This has an infinite number of possibilities between any two values. So you can count on and on. It can be divided into fractions and decimals. So let's think of what might be examples of this. You could have the number of calories you've ingested in a day. Calories can be broken up into fractional parts. The room temperature can be broken up into fractional parts. The percent of a task that you've completed can be broken down into smaller than a whole number. So these are continuous variables. Think of them like a number line where there is an infinite number of possibilities between the two values. You can keep breaking down things into smaller and smaller pieces. An important characteristic of a continuous variable, and this is really important for lesson 2, so make sure you have this. There are boundaries of intervals for scores. So there's something called a real limit that separates two adjacent continuous scores. And that boundary is exactly halfway between the scores. You have an upper limit and a lower limit. And these are called real limits for continuous variables. So for example, for a score of 5, the real limits are 4.5 to 5.5 because 4.5 is halfway in between 5 and 4. 5.5 is halfway between 5 and 6. And so what are the real limits then for 6? The real limits for 6 are going to be 5.5 and 6.5. Because when we have a number line, we cannot have any gaps. This is going to be very important when we're talking about histograms. All right, so I want you to remember the 7 types of variables. We had independent and dependent variables. Those go together. We have extraneous variables, and then confounding variables are a type of extraneous variable. And then 3 different ways that we kind of define variables are categorical, discrete, and continuous. Make sure that you have these definitions down. They might not make a lot of sense right now as to why you would need to know them, but you will need to know them. If you have any questions, please bring them to the Hallway Conversations Forum.